I've seen a lot of cops get hurt because they were afraid to use a little bit of violence early. And so what wound up happening is they had to use more violence later.
Hey gang, I guarantee if you're watching the main channel, you're seeing these videos of people in self-defense encounters all the time. People start bleeding, they start bleeding fast. And we as self-defenders should be interested in all the tools that can protect and preserve innocent life. And good trauma gear can do that. It's just as important as a firearm, maybe more so. Trauma is trauma. Whether it's a vehicle accident, a farming accident, or a gunshot wound, when seconds count, you need the right equipment for the job. You must get your trauma gear from a reputable source, and Mountain Man Medical is ASP's go-to source for all of our medical gear. Go to mountainmanmedical.com and let them know you heard about them on the ASP podcast. All right, folks, welcome back to the Active Self-Protection Podcast. I am your host, Mike Williver, your favorite former Fed. With us today, Asa Keefe. Asa is a 10-year police officer. He's a police officer, too, with a major metropolitan police department. He served one tour in the United States Marine Corps. He left as a sergeant. He is now a patrol officer, a member of the SWAT team, and a field training officer. So he's got a lot of irons in the fire. Asa, thanks so much for being with us today.
Hey, Mike, thanks for having us.
You know, John hooked us up together to have this conversation, and we were just talking about what we're going to talk about. And I've decided we're just going to talk and see what comes out of it. You have some pretty interesting stories, so I think this will go pretty well. You're married. Do you have any kids?
I am married. I have no kids.
Okay, and you've been with this agency for 10 years now. Prior to that, you were a Marine.
That's right.
Did you grow up in that area?
I did not. I actually grew up on the East Coast. We'll just say that I'm on the West Coast, and I grew up on the East Coast. I actually grew up in Vermont, very, very small town. Ultimately, the Marine Corps drew me away from Vermont and brought me to the West Coast. But I grew up in a very small town, and now I live in a much larger city. Yeah, Vermont is lovely. We had some friends there. We went up to the White Mountains a couple of times and hung out with some friends of mine. A guy was a Boy Scout with me. And it was absolutely lovely. A little too cold for me in the winter, and a little too much Bernie Sanders for me now to actually want to live there. But Vermont is delightful. Very ruggedly independent people up there in Vermont. What made you decide to join the Marine Corps? And give us maybe some info about when you joined and the events that were going on at that time. So I ultimately joined in 2001, and I wound up going to boot camp just shortly after 9/11. But I would say certainly 9/11 influenced me and motivated me. But I would say that at the root motivation for me was, at the time, 40 years old seemed really old. I am now 41, and it seems very young. But my motivation was I didn't want to be 40 looking back on my life and wondering if I could have done it, right? If I had what it took to be a Marine. And so I wanted to find that out about myself. So that was really the most important factor for me, was just to challenge myself and overcome that so that I could say it. And honestly, I'm really glad that I did. Being a Marine opened up a lot of doors for me. Sometimes I think people give Marines too much credit. People just assume because you were a Marine, you have a certain level of confidence or competence. But for me, it really did open up a lot of doors and connect me to a lot of communities that I'm real happy about today. So I'm really glad that I made that decision when I did and became a Marine, and it led me to here. And I'm real happy with how my life's going. So when you joined the Marines, when you actually signed on the dotted line, it was just before 9/11. Is that correct? That's right. I was going through MEPS when 9/11 kicked off. Okay. And so when you get to Paris, you were Paris Island Marine, East Coast Marine. So when you get there, how much talk is there by the staff and the instructors about what's going on and how that's going to affect you guys as young Marines? That was definitely a major topic of conversation, and would continue to be, obviously, throughout my time in the Marines. I remember we had one guy in our platoon in boot camp who had signed up to be an MP, military police, and we had a drill instructor that got very mad at him because he was going to be writing tickets to guys who were going to be going down range and doing real work. And I just remember being really glad that I had signed up to be infantry, so I wouldn't get yelled at by that particular drill instructor. Yeah, that's not necessarily true. I good friend of mine, a fellow instructor with my old agency, was an MP for 4 years, and
did a lot of good work. He had a critical incident where he came about 0.3 pounds of trigger pressure away from having to shoot a Marine who was threatening to kill his wife on base. So it's not all ticket writing and waving people through at the gate. There's a lot more to being any kind of military police than that.
No, that's absolutely true, and that actually goes for pretty much any job. I think, especially as a younger man, I put a lot of emphasis on people's titles, roles, and as I've gotten older, I've learned that there are people from all walks of life that have a lot to bring to the table and a lot of competence. And if we give too much credence to those titles, we often miss things, both good and bad, about people. Like I referenced earlier, a lot of people say like, oh, you were a Marine, so you must be good at this, that, or the other thing. And while I appreciate the vote of confidence, I've known lots of Marines that weren't good at all those things. So I've found it's much better to judge people as you find them and less so by their title.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. If you you don't think the work of a custodian is important, a janitor is important, spend some time in an office where they don't have custodial janitorial services, and you will learn very quickly how important that job is. And it's just one more job. I consider in any organization, any job that exists, as long as it's not a pointless pencil pushing job, any job that exists is there for a reason. And it doesn't, not everyone has the glory in any organization. The police department can't function without all the support people behind the scenes. They're not all charging through doors with guns blazing. Same thing, I'm sure, is true of the Marine Corps.
That's definitely the truth.
Yeah, I think that I think Martin Luther King was quoting the Old Testament when he said, "Do all the things you do as you would before God. Don't do it for just for the check or just for the accolades, but do everything you do, whether it's a janitor or whether you're the president of the United States, do all the things that you do to the best of your ability." And that's a super honorable way to live. So you get out of boot camp and your MOS was infantry. Yep. How long before you are shipped off to Iraq?
Pretty quickly. I think we had about 6 months or so in the fleet. I was stationed out on the West Coast, and about 6 months or so in the fleet of spin up, and then we actually wind up going to Kuwait first. And it was an interesting time, especially in retrospect. Now that I know more about the Marine Corps, all of my senior Marines, so the guys that have been in for a year or so longer, the Marine Corps is really big on seniority. So if I got promoted on the first of the month and you got promoted on the second of the month, I am senior to you. And the Marines, if you put 15 Marines in a room, they will organize themselves 1 through 15 of who's senior, and they have all kinds of ways of figuring it out. So our senior Marines talked about their experiences, and of course we're looking to them. And it was all about going to Okinawa, doing a float, going to Australia, where were the good Libo ports. That was kind of the topic of conversation. And then as we realized that we were not going to be going to Okinawa or Australia, that it was interesting to see the focus change. I'm actually one of them at the time when I got in the Marines. To say that you'd never been on a ship was just odd, but I did over 4 years and I never set foot on a ship. Because I flew to Iraq for all of my tours, and that was how I got there. So yeah, my senior Marines experience was quite different from mine. I suspect mine is more typical at this point. I was at the beginning of the global war of terror on terror, but now I suspect my experience is probably pretty typical for an infantry Marine. But things change. I have friends. The police department attracts the military, so there's plenty of Marines of all generations. And, it's interesting to talk to guys who got into the Marine Corps years after I got out and then recently got out, and their experiences there are some things that never changed, and there are some things that are very different. Any Marines that are listening will laugh when I say I qualled with iron sights, but nobody does that anymore. Everybody uses red dots now. And that's just the times they are changing, right?
I think part of the theme of this episode is going to be, largely the journey from military to law enforcement, because I worked in San Diego for 22 years as a Fed, and I would say a third to half at any given time of my coworkers were generally Navy and Marine Corps, former Navy and Marine Corps. We work with some Navy SEALs,
Sure.
recon Marines, and you just runs the whole gamut. It really is kind of a natural progression to go from the military into law enforcement, because law enforcement is a paramilitary organization, and it's kind of a familiar. It's like an old coat. It fits nicely. So you get out of boot camp, and now all of a sudden you're going to be going to Kuwait, not Okinawa. You're not going to be seeing any beautiful Australian women anytime soon. So you get to Kuwait, and what's that like? It had to be, just the scope of it had to be impressive.
Yeah, so that was one of the I mean, I didn't have anything to compare it to, so that's part of my perspective on this is now I look back on it, and like I said, I talk with other guys. There are permanent camps in place where when I got there, it was just desert, and we were putting up the tents, and we were digging holes, and we were setting up fighting positions, and we didn't really know what to expect. There was a lot of talk about biological weapons, so we did a fair amount of mop drills. Military guys will be familiar with that, but basically it involves putting on a charcoal-filled snowsuit and a gas mask, which is not an ideal outfit for the desert, and kind of waiting. We didn't know if we were going to get chemical agents dropped on us. We didn't really know what was going to happen, and certainly as a PFC. In the infantry, nobody brought me in on any of the big decision, meetings or like that. So a lot of waiting, kind of sit and wait and train. We didn't have. So now again, I'll talk to guys that deployed recently, and they have internet cafes and phone banks and all kinds of stuff. We didn't have any of that. We didn't even really have mail for quite a while. It took a while for mail to begin to function. So we landed, and I don't remember the name of the airport we landed in, but we landed in a commercial airport in Kuwait, and then got loaded onto buses that had the windows blacked out with curtains. And then we were driven to a camp that they were in the process of building somewhere out in the desert near the border. And then we stayed there for 2 or 3 months. And I believe, if I remember correctly, it was sometime in March that we set off. And my unit was in amphibious tracks, and I don't know how I don't know how familiar you are with Iraq, but it is not. We were not coming out of a boat. We were driving across the ocean. Not a lot of water not a lot of water. It was so pretty cramped, pretty dark, pretty uncomfortable. And we pushed all the way through. We ultimately went all the way to Baghdad before pulling back a little bit to another position and setting up. And there was a lot of unknown in that because they were making it up as they went, right? They didn't really know when we were going to get rotated back to the States or whatever. But I wound up doing. I wound up going over a few times, and each time was similar in that it was still in the beginning. My last tour was 2005, and when I came back to the States, I got out of the Marine Corps at the very beginning of 2006. January of 2006 was when I finally left the Marine Corps.
I think a lot of people, in hindsight, knowing how it went, with 2020 hindsight, it went pretty well. We didn't lose a lot of guys in the invasion. I would imagine the mood on the ground with you and your fellow Marines was not, this is going to be a cakewalk, right?
No, I mean, like I said, there's so much unknown, and anybody who's been through just the boot camp will know. Like, if you could go through boot camp a second time, or a police academy, or any stuff like that, if anything you could go through the second time would be so much easier than the first time, because the first time part of the game is you don't know what's going to happen next. And I mean, drill instructors are playing a game, an important game in training by not giving you that information. So you have to deal with it. And what they're preparing you for is exactly what we wound up dealing with. Was we don't know. It's the unknown, and the unknown can be pretty disorienting. But yeah, we definitely were. I mean, I would be lying if I said we weren't scared. We were definitely scared. But yeah, we did not lose a lot of guys. I definitely did lose some friends, but it certainly could have been a whole lot worse. The initial push, the Republican Guard gave us some gave us some trouble in some various spots, but ultimately we were pretty successful.
So I don't know if you've seen this or not, but there is an HBO limited series that I've watched twice because I enjoyed it so much, because I think it's so realistic. Maybe you can tell me if you've seen it and if it is as realistic as I think it is. Generation Kill. Have you seen this show?
Yeah, I was gonna say you're talking about Generation Kill. I have been told I should watch it. I have avoided watching it just because I'm not sure I want to watch it. But I have heard the same thing. I have heard that it is a very accurate representation of what we went through. So I believe that it is. And I want to say one of the actors was actually a Marine that participated in the invasion.
Okay.
Did I hear that? Is that right? I don't know if that's true or not.
That sounds right. And they have one of the characters in the show, one of the shadowy characters you rarely see as a character named Godfather, who I'm not sure if they name him as General Mattis or not, but that's who we're talking about in the show. And I thought it was really well done. And I think I related to it so much because of the level, the guttural humor that the Marines use is a lot like what you'd see in a police station locker room. Very similar stuff. Because if you do that kind of work,
absolutely.
If you're at war, or you're, whether you're at war as a Marine or a soldier, or whether you're in a bunch of little combat tours as a law enforcement officer, you do tend to develop a rather dark sense of humor, and that's not because you don't care about the people you're interacting with or because you think anything's particularly funny, but because if you don't laugh, you'll cry. If you can't make fun of some of the stuff, you'll lose your mind. You won't make it through. You won't make it through a whole career. Not any large size agency that I've ever heard of. So I worked.
That's absolutely true.
I worked a lot of task forces. And without naming your agency, I can say that I worked in task forces along with your agency, and an absolutely proud organization, really squared away. And I think part of why I have such a high opinion of state and local is because I worked in that area for so long, and rarely did I meet a local police officer or sheriff's deputy who wasn't completely squared away, articulate, bright, good at their job, knowledgeable about the law, fair-minded. And I go some other places in the country, and I'm like, oh, not exactly the same. Just depends where you are, I suppose.
Yeah.
With that said,
that's a really interesting point. Just let me touch on that, because that's something that I have thought about a lot as a police officer and as a Marine. So if I say that I'm a Marine, it means that there's only two places that I can go to boot camp. So the origin for Marines is pretty much going to be universally one of two places. And the standards for a Marine across, whether you're stationed in Hawaii or whether you're stationed in Pendleton or Lejeune, all of those, the standards are the same. The physical fitness standards, the testing standards. So things may vary slightly from unit to unit, but generally speaking, a Marine is a Marine. We use that same terminology in our culture, in our country, in the United States. We say police officer, and you'll often have, in any given county, you'll have like a dozen agencies, right? Every little town has their own. There's the state cops, right? So, but the average person does not necessarily see the difference. They just see a uniform and a badge and a black and white car. And so cop is a cop is a cop. But the standards for training and for our stuff can vary pretty wildly from state to state, city to city, and department to department. So one of the problems I have as a cop is people will say, well, that's a cop. And I'm like, well, but what kind of cop are you talking about? Because there's a difference. And this really is true when we're talking about local, municipal level stuff. Federal stuff tends to be more unified and have a, one set of standards, but local cops don't. So that's definitely something that the perception is cops are cops, but the reality is that every little department is different and has different standards and stuff like that.
So as we mentioned in the beginning, you left the Marine Corps as a sergeant, so a supervisor. You're now on the SWAT team, and you're a field training officer, FTO, for your agency. If the agency is good and it's squared away, and not all of them are necessarily, they don't just let anyone become an FTO. They want the officer who's going to train the brand new young officer out of the academy to be squared away, to know the law, to be able to articulate stuff and be a good teacher. When you were in the Marine Corps, you were telling me a story earlier about just an incident that happened just walk our audience real quick through through what the government building was, where it was, and that incident that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, so I was part of a group of Marines that was guarding what we called the government building, and it was a building that was being used as the offices for the people where we were trying to install a democratic government, and that made it a target, and so it was attacked pretty regularly, and unfortunately, in this case, it was staffed by a lot of non-combat MOSs because we just didn't have the bodies, so we had to put them. We had to get bodies from somewhere. So we had an attack. We were up on the roof, and during the attack, some cargo netting fell down on a couple of Marines. And anybody who doesn't know what cargo netting is, it's a net. It functions as shade when it's held up in the air, but when it falls down on top of somebody, it functions as a net. So it had fallen on these two Marines and their machine gun, and we kind of needed that to get up and running. And I had a moment of clarity up on that roof. And so I cut them out and got them squared away on the gun and sort of showed them what they needed to do. But I did it without, cursing at them or screaming at them or yelling at them, which is not how my sergeant would have done it when I was a PFC. And at that moment just has always stuck with me for me, like that's the way I want to teach people. And I've always enjoyed teaching as a vocation. I don't particularly want to be a teacher. I love being a cop, but being an FTO seemed like a natural fit for me because it allowed me to teach this profession that I really love. And I approach being an FTO in a similar way. I tell my trainees, I have a number of spiels that I go over. Anybody who's been my trainee knows these spiels. And one of them is, you will be in my car for a month, and I hope by the end of it, you see me as a resource and not just, another critical voice. I will certainly be critical, but ultimately I want you to learn, and I want you to see me as somebody you can come to and ask questions. And we were talking about this before the podcast, but one of the most gratifying things for me that can happen is to have a trainee come back to me, a year later, where they don't have to, they could go to any officer. There's no obligation to go to me. I'm no longer their field training officer. I'm not in their chain of command, but they seek me out for advice because they remember me as being somebody who helped them and was a good guide along the path. And that's really gratifying for me. So that's a part of the job I really love.
Yeah, I was a instructor in several different roles with my old agency. Probably the most fun I had was as a firearms instructor. And I very much took your tack in that I didn't feel that yelling and screaming was going to get a lot done. And I had a number of agents who were my students come to me later and say, hey, I was in this situation and I remembered something you told me, or your voice was in my head, or, hey, thanks for taking the time and coming alongside me and being reasonable and working through the problem. Because I guess if it weren't for the yelly, screamy types, there'd be nothing to compare us to. So thank God for the yelly, screamy types. People can appreciate that we don't yell and scream at them. But I completely understand where you're going with that 100%. You leave the Marine Corps. What gave you the idea to go into law enforcement, or had you had that idea in your head already?
I certainly thought about being a cop as a kid. I think most kids, play with the idea of being a cop, being a firefighter. I've always been drawn to weapons and fighting. So I wanted to be a cop when I was a kid, just because, they got a gun and firefighters didn't. But it certainly didn't stick with me as a dream. I wasn't one of those guys that knew I wanted to be a cop. I was actually at a shooting match, and I was a bit at a crossroads in my life trying to figure out what to do. My now wife was my girlfriend at the time. And I was just kind of trying to figure out what to do with my life. And I was at a shooting match, and I got paired up with a cop, which initially made me nervous because I was in California. Gun laws in California being what they are, you don't necessarily want to be at a shooting match and be near a cop. But he was super chill, great guy, really nice. And we just got to talking about life. And he said, hey, man, why don't you put in an application with us? And I kind of thought about it. I was like, man, that actually sounds pretty appealing. So I put in an application, and took about 3 months, and I was in the academy.
The academy you went to, if I'm not mistaken, is a regional academy, right? So there's more than one agency at the academy?
Yeah, that's right.
One of the outgrowths of that, and you can tell me if this was true for you or not, was you're in the academy with people from all these different agencies that are going to be in and around your area. So you actually make contacts with people right off the bat that you can maybe use later on in your career to help with investigation or, just whatever, just directions through a town. So you completed the academy. How did your police academy compare to Marine basic training?
It certainly wasn't as physically demanding. It wasn't. It didn't put the same mental stress on me. I was also quite a bit older. The youngest you can be in a police academy is you can start it at 20 and a half years old, but when you graduate, you need to be 21. So that's the youngest. And they don't generally have a lot of guys that young because they like some life experience. But I was definitely on the older end of our academy. I was 31 when I went through. But I certainly wasn't the oldest. We had a retired Marine there who was 43 or 47 or something like that. Then we had a retired fire chief who had done 30 years in the fire department and I think he was 53 years old. He was super fit. And he graduated the academy. But so, I was by no means the oldest, but I was on the older end of the spectrum. As you get older, obviously all of the sort of the mental games that academies and boot camps play, it's not that they aren't stressful, but you see them for what they are.
Right.
You recognize what's going on, and it's much easier to deal with it. The biggest thing that struck me about the police academy versus some of the other schools and training that I've done, it was very much a college course. There was a lot of sort of that type of material, and full disclosure, I didn't graduate college, so I'm only speaking with some knowledge on that. But there was a lot of knowledge that you really needed to have. And then as an FTO, I've come to realize even more so how important that was. One of the things we talk about in law enforcement is the elements of a crime. I'm sure you're familiar with that term, but if some of your listeners aren't, basically what we're talking about is there are certain events that need to occur for a crime to meet the definition of the crime. So an easy example would be like a burglary is the entering of a structure with the intent to commit theft or any other felony. So I would, if I want to charge somebody with burglary, those elements need to be met. I need to be able to prove that they entered the building, and I need to be able to prove that they committed theft or some other felony while inside the building. Understanding those elements is so crucial to doing our day-to-day job. And this is one of the things that I really emphasize with my trainees, because it allows you to make decisions faster. And ultimately, that's what we have to do. When someone calls 911 and says, hey, I need a police officer, for whatever reason, essentially what they are saying is, I have lost control of this situation and I need someone to come take control. So your job is to come take control. So sometimes it's just, my 15-year-old is in the park and is refusing to come inside. Well, that's a relatively simple one. I would like to think that everybody could handle that on their own, but sometimes they can't. So they call us. So that one's not a super high stress one. But another one might be, like you mentioned earlier with your friend that was a military police, somebody has taken, my friend's spouse has taken her hostages and holding a knife to her neck, right? That's a much higher pressure. So being able to create sort of calmness out of chaos is is the bread and butter of our job, is responding to that and understanding the elements of the crime. And so what exactly is going on? What do you have and how do you deal with it? Because the way I will handle a domestic violence incident is going to be very different from how I'm going to handle, two guys pushing each other outside a bar. Those are not the same event. And so that's understanding those elements and how you need to respond to them is important. And that's something that you begin to learn in the academy. You
said to bring calmness to an out of control situation. I'm paraphrasing, of course. I like to say calm is a superpower. If you can remain calm when if you can keep your head when all those around you are losing theirs, then you'll be a man, my son. The ability to show up at a chaotic scene and bring order to it, not by firing shots into the air, hitting people with a stick, but just to be a calming presence in the situation is so important in LE. And we all know the one guy on the shift who shows up and makes everything worse. Who gets everybody spun up when you were just getting things calmed down. You know that guy, right?
Oh yeah, man. That's you absolutely. That's if you're in law enforcement, what you just said is a trope. We all know it. Every single cop who's been a cop for more than 5 minutes is like, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, and you're 100% correct. Being able to bring calm to a situation without using violence is huge. And to be clear, I said without using violence. I didn't say not being good at it. I am somewhat notorious for showing up to chaotic radio calls and acting casual, to the point where I have been called out by people who don't know me very well to say, oh, that doesn't strike me as very safe. For example, I will often respond to slightly violent people with a cup of coffee in my hand.
Yeah.
And I'm notorious for drinking coffee out of a stainless steel coffee mug. Everyone who works with me knows, oh yeah, there's Asa with his cup of coffee. All my trainees know that I drink coffee constantly. But if you have a really upset and maybe even slightly inebriated person, because we can always toss alcohol into the mix and that always makes it more complicated, and you show up and point a weapon at them, which is justified, to be clear. I'm not saying don't do that. I'm saying if you do that, the person will clearly see you as confronting them, and you are, and maybe you should be. But if you have the confidence because you have, all the experience and training to walk up to them with a cup of coffee in your hand, they won't see that you can hit them in the face with the coffee if you want to. They won't see that your other hand is free to access weapons if you need to. But what they'll see is somebody taking a sip of coffee, and it might just bring them down a notch or two. And then you can resolve this without, having to, get anybody hurt or use violence when it wasn't necessary. I've seen a lot of cops get hurt because they were afraid to use a little bit of violence early. And so what wound up happening is they had to use more violence later. So that's also an experience thing, is being able to read the situation and say, what do I need to do right now to end this as quickly as possible?
I'm sure, like me, you've seen some videos where officers end up getting hurt. And as you're watching, before the violence occurs, you're watching what's going on in your head. You're screaming, what are you waiting for? Like, this guy is he's going to be under arrest any second now. And you're just letting him get more and more spun up. You just need to get in there now and take care of business.
Yeah, that goes right back to the elements, right? So if you can process the elements fast enough and realize, wait a minute, I have the elements for a felony crime. The guy in front of me is under arrest. Sometimes, especially with trainees, I'll say, why didn't you just snatch that guy up? And they'll say, well, I wasn't sure if I could. I didn't know if he was under arrest yet. And so that's them not being able to put the elements together quickly enough to recognize, oh, this is a felony suspect. I can punch him if I need. Like, it's on. Like, he's going to go into handcuffs, full stop. And then, like you said, we watch those things where me and you are watching it going, that guy's under arrest, grab him. And they don't grab him, and then he gets to a weapon, and then it turns into a much bigger thing than it needed to be.
I like to think that the people, I never was a field training officer or agent per se, but they just kind of partner you with a younger guy or a new guy at the academy. There was no
official program.
Yeah, defined official field training program. I think there is now. There wasn't when I was there. I was just fortunate that when I got out of the academy in '96 from the feds, that I just had squared away older agents to take me under their wing and show me what's what. When I had younger people, I tried to explain to them that dealing with a suspect. Let's say it's, for me, a lot of my cases were border dope. They were, Customs and Border Protection finds a load of dope in a car, and they call me down to unscrew it and to figure it out and to do an interview. And I've always found that walking into that interview room as the agent and saying, hey, man, my name is Mike, shake his hand. How are you? Can I get you anything? Instead of, I'm Special Agent Williver and, hitting him in the face with your badge.
Yeah.
There's that calm is also a superpower, just to be able to say, hey, man, I know this sucks. I know you don't want to be here. Neither do I, frankly, in this depressing cinder block room with a stainless steel table. We're going to get through this. I blah, blah, blah. Mirandize them and go from there, rather than coming in heavy-handed. Because I've watched young agents who I was helping them with their case in an interview just completely blow it, completely cause the bad guy to clam up and not talk because they were so overly aggressive for no reason. The bad guy's sitting there calmly, and you come in over the top. Same thing with street cops. And like I said earlier, there's that guy who you're on a scene and you've gotten everything calmed down, and this other officer shows up. It just gets everybody all spun up again, and that's suboptimal cops. Let's not do that. So tell me about SWAT training. Don't give away any inside secrets, but I think a lot of our listeners would be fascinated to hear what that's like. And like, for example, we start with what is the process for selecting a SWAT officer? I assume they ask for volunteers and then you put your hand up, and then what happens?
Yeah, correct. So on our department, we have we are fortunate enough to have a big enough department to have so we have a full-time team, which we call SRT, and then we have a patrol-based team, which is called PRT, and that actually stands for primary response and secondary response. And a little history on our SWAT team, if I may. There's an incident. I'm sure John is familiar that you may be familiar with it. It was called the Rosebush shooting. I believe it was it was a long time ago. I think it was in the 80s. It might have even been the 70s. But basically, two cops responded to a neighbor argument over a rosebush. And the cops, as you would expect, told both of the neighbors to stop being silly and go inside. And one of the neighbors took umbrage at that, went inside, got a rifle, came out, ambushed both the cops in the driveway, shot them both. And there was a standoff with the guy for 40 minutes. And the cops both bled out while the responding officers tried to figure out what to do. And that was sort of the impetus for, we need to have a team in place that can respond to that and has the tactics and the weapons to address that kind of threat. And I apologize to anybody who's listening who knows that story better than me. I may have flubbed some of the details, but you get the gist of it.
Sure.
So that was the genesis for let's get this team together. So our primary response team is the team that you initially try out for. And the role of that team is it's a patrol-based SWAT operation. So at any given time, we want to have a decent number of officers working in the field, doing patrol stuff, answering radio calls, but they have all their kit with them. And so, and by kit, I mean rifle, plates, helmet, and then some specialized munitions and stuff like that. And then they can respond to sort of critical incidents. And we can escalate that all the way from, just kind of a felony hot stop on a stolen vehicle all the way up to a barricaded suspect or an active shooter. And we can call in all the resources. And of course, the full-time team is that's the varsity guys. So if something really needs to get handled, we'll pull them in. The downside to them is their response time is going to be a little bit longer generally than the patrol-based guys. Initially, you would be trying out for the patrol base, the primary response team. And the first thing is to just, like you said, volunteer and say, hey, I'm interested. There's usually some sort of minimum requirements in terms of time on the department. You don't have a lot of discipline pending, all that kind of stuff. And once they have those applicants, they will set a trial date. And so that'll be one day, and the day starts with some shooting stuff. Anybody who has gone through any of the ASP shooting programs would not find this shooting particularly challenging. Although I will say that one of the things that we see over and over again in training and in tryouts is the mental pressure.
Yep.
Everybody who shows up to shoot to try out for SWAT is more than capable of shooting a perfect score if they're just hanging out with their friends on the range. But when you have the whole SWAT team, one officer behind every candidate, and they're evaluating everything you do, it puts some pressure on you. So we do a shoot, and then everybody who passes the shoot goes on to a physical fitness test in the afternoon. And the physical fitness test is, all the stuff you would expect: push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups, 440 dash, and then a pretty extensive obstacle course. And then your combined score from that and your combined score from your shooting will give you a place. Everybody who passes both of those events, the shooting and the physical, gets an opportunity to interview. So then you'll go to an interview. It's a formal interview. So you put on your dress uniform, and there's 3 people on a panel, and you'll have a chance to talk about yourself, your background, why you deserve a shot at the academy. And then they will ask you some specific questions about policies and scenarios regarding SWAT. And the interviews usually run about 20 minutes. So you can expect to be answering questions for about 20 minutes. And then out of all the people who interview, they will select people for our academy. So my academy, I think we had 125-ish applicants. I think 70 of us got interviews, so made it through the shooting and the physical. And then out of those 70, 26 of us were selected for the academy.
Remember, folks, all that happens, and then you get to start training. So it's not like you're done with it, then you're a SWAT member. So you go through all that stuff. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I've been around a lot of agencies, and I think that's generally the blueprint for a SWAT member to join the team. That's probably almost semi-universal. I'm sure there are some small departments where they don't have enough people. They just everyone's got to be SWAT qualified because there's so few officers. So you finish going through all that and you make the cut. Then are you pulled off your normal duties to go to an academy, or is it something you do on the weekends, or how does that work?
Correct. So they set a date for the academy, usually a few months after all that. They'll release the names. They'll say, okay, these are the 26 that we've selected. And then a couple of months from now, we're going to do the academy. So 30 days out from the start of the academy, we do what they call a day zero. And that's a little taste of the academy. It's a one-day academy, and it's basically to sort of familiarize you with what they're going to expect, and also a chance for them to issue you all your gear, your new rifle and helmet and plates and all that good stuff. And then the academy starts. Our academy was a month long, 4 weeks. And you are out of patrol. That's all you're doing is the academy for those 4 weeks. And we started with 26. And at the end of that academy, we graduated 16.
So 10 people didn't even make it through. That's tough. I mean, you were talking earlier about the mental aspect of it. I was at firearms instructor school at Fort Benning for my agency, and there was a guy there who was a SWAT member. He, always scored a perfect score every time he qualified, whether it was shotgun, M4, or pistol. And we had the first, or I think day 1 or day 2, there's a very, very simple shooting course. It's unlimited time, and it's a big target, and you have to get so many rounds inside the circle. It's really, really basic. And I watched this guy melt down. I watched him throw one round outside of the circle he's supposed to be in, and you could see it happen. You could watch him absolutely spiral until he was just blowing rounds all over the place, and he failed. He got sent home. So yeah, that mental aspect of it is huge, especially when you got all these super cool SWAT operator types watching you and feeling probably a little intimidated by all of what's going on around you. So if you're going through something like that, just remember, if you're going, especially when it comes to shooting, just remember your fundamentals. Just do what you already know how to do.
I would guess, I haven't been a firearms instructor at our range, but I would guess that you have watched a lot of people shoot a lot of quals. And usually a qual has an accuracy portion and a time portion, right? So you have so many seconds to shoot so many rounds. I would hazard a guess that you have seen lots of people fail by missing and very few people fail by going over time.
If you have 10 seconds to do an iteration, any round you fire after the 10 seconds is not going to count. But if someone is taking enough time, not being slow, but being deliberate, and so that costs them, 5 points for one round versus someone who's in a hurry and worried and nervous and kind of spraying and praying, that's, 100%. I can tell you, I've seen people have bad days. Good shooters have bad days. I was at the range once doing our instructor qual, and we have to get 90% or better versus 70% or better for everybody else. And I unraveled that day. I didn't know what was wrong. Nothing particularly going on at home. No real stress in my life. I just had a bad day, and I shot like crap. And I had a second chance, and my buddy comes over. He goes, "You're not breathing." I'm like, "What do you mean I'm not breathing?" He goes, "You're holding your breath." And I'm like, "Get out of here. I'm not holding my breath." So I go back to the line, the 25-yard line. I start there, and I just focus on my breathing. And guess what? Boom, that was it. Before I'd draw, I'd go, I didn't realize I was doing it. And I would be shooting like this. And I was completely blowing it. And it's that, not to get too far afield, but that just shows you how important a good instructor is. I was always the guy, like I said, who would come alongside. I love working with a struggling shooter. There's two kinds of people who aren't doing well: struggling shooters and people who are just obstinate and think they know everything. And there's plenty of those in the law enforcement world that you have to deal with.
Oh, yeah.
But I used to love coming alongside a struggling shooter and helping them work through stuff. That's another great gratifying feeling, is helping someone to get better at something and not by yelling at them. Although yelling is occasionally required. It has
its place.
I had a student. I was teaching a shotgun class, and I had a student muzzle me twice in a row with a loaded chambered shotgun, and I did some yelling that day, and he went home.
Yeah, I've taken some great shooting classes from some great instructors, and one of the things I've heard them talk about is safety violations, and what you just described. And one of the things they've said is, look, if you're making that kind of mistake, you're overloaded for the day.
Right.
So you should go home, because you have your brain is full. You're making mistakes that you shouldn't be making, and you're doing them because you're overloaded. And actually, I saw that happen in our SWAT Academy. Of the 10 people that didn't make it, 6. We do our shooting standards in the first 3 days. And anybody who's ever shot a USPSA match or a 3-gun match would not find our shooting standards particularly challenging. They are similar to a 3-gun stage or a 2-gun stage, I guess.
Right.
But if you haven't ever shot with a timer behind you before, or you're not super familiar with the AR platform, so maybe you've got 10 hours of instruction, and this is your first real introduction, and you're in the SWAT Academy, and you're in your gear for 10 to 12 hours, and there's a lot of pressure. We lost 6 out of the 10 just in those first 3 days because of shooting standards, and I watched it happen to guys that probably could have technically done the shooting, but because of all the added pressures, their brains were full and they couldn't do it. And we had one of the 6 was a safety violation, and it was exactly what you just described. Is the officer muzzled people with a live weapon, and there is zero tolerance for that in the SWAT Academy. So that was an immediate go home. Yeah,
that's definitely that's a go home every day of the week. And you know what?
Yep.
We would occasionally have like friendly competitions. All the instructors would show up, and we'd run through everybody would bring their own firearms training exercise to run through, and they'd run it, and it was a lot of fun. We would say at the beginning of the day, hey, listen, any safety violations, you're going to be asked to leave. It's nothing personal. It doesn't mean we're mad at you, but as a professional, you have to recognize when you screwed up in a serious way like that, and just take your lumps and go home and clear your head, because it's a bad look when you're the one drawing your weapon too early or putting your finger on the trigger when it shouldn't be, or God forbid, muzzling someone. So you need to be a big boy or girl and understand that you've transgressed and not make a big stink about it, because there's no worse look than a cop who gets butthurt because he or she made a mistake and is asked to go home. So you finish SWAT training. I assume the SWAT training itself was fairly rigorous. You get back out in the field. How long until you're actually called out to a incident where the patrol version of SWAT is needed? Do you remember?
The goal of our SWAT Academy is, when you graduate the academy, you should be capable of responding to an event the very next day. And we were talking about teaching earlier, and I've only been through one SWAT Academy, so I don't have a lot to compare it to. I have a lot of friends across the country that are in a lot of different departments, and some of the departments, not all SWAT Academies are equal, for sure. But I've only been through one, but I will say that the cadre that taught my academy, it was very clear that as instructors, they were firm, and they weren't there to be your friend, but they very much wanted you to learn the information. And the people that got bounced either straight up failed an evaluation, like they couldn't shoot the drill to a high enough standard, or they were not picking up what they were being taught. But if you could listen to them, and they wanted to teach you, they were really good teachers. And that was the environment. It wasn't easy, and we were held to a high standard, but every single one of the instructors wanted us to get the information and was making a real effort to make sure that we really were prepared. And I certainly wouldn't have been the best candidate to respond to a SWAT call out, but I definitely felt prepared to respond to a SWAT call out on day one. A good friend of mine who went through the academy a few years before me, actually his first day out of the academy responded to a bank robbery. I think mine was a couple of weeks, and I believe it was a barricaded suspect. And I think he ultimately wound up giving up, which is often the outcome for a SWAT response.
Yeah, that's what you're hoping for.
Is we sit there and surround them and wait, and then they eventually give up.
So with that, do you want to tell the good folks at home what the unofficial SWAT acronym actually stands for?
Sit, wait, and talk.
That's right. Sit, wait, and talk, ladies and gentlemen at home, because there's a lot of sitting around and waiting. If you don't know what a SWAT team is actually for, the SWAT team is who the cops call when the cops can't safely handle a situation, and they need the SWAT cops to come and do stuff that they're especially trained to do. And I think there's a misconception in the general public that SWAT cops are just these, meat-eating, meatheads, and all they do is work out all day. And these guys are some of the smartest cops I've ever worked with, generally speaking. They're bright, they're articulate, and they're very good at what they do. And thank God for them, because I was only a patrol officer for a brief time in a police department back east. But if I'm at a door and there's some parolee, felon, whatever, that I'm talking to at the door, and he decides to close the door and run back in the house, guess what I don't want to do if I don't have to? I don't want to have to kick that door and go in there with me and my partner in our level 2 or level 3A armor with pistols and deal with this guy who potentially has a rifle. I'd much rather be able to back out, call these professional guys in, and let them handle business, because they really, most of the time, unless the suspect kills themselves, which unfortunately happens a lot, most of the time they get this worked out. They either talk the guy out or they smoke him out with CS or OC or whatever. I worked with our SRT with my agency, and those guys were absolutely phenomenally good at what they did. I'll tell you a quick story as an aside. One of the last things I did when I was in the San Diego area was to be rear perimeter on a search warrant. Mm-hmm. I'm on rear perimeter, and I had to go evacuate the woman from the house behind us because there was reason to believe this guy was armed, so they wanted to get the neighbors out of their houses before they hit the house. So I get her out, I get her little dog out, she goes across the street to the neighbors, and I'm standing at the back fence, and I'm just standing there with my M4 and my normal body armor, and I hear some rustling in the bushes. So I look to my left, and something flies through the air. Well, that something was a flashbang, and no one had told me as rear perimeter there was going to be a flashbang deployed in the backyard. So I'm squinting my eyes with my mouth open, looking hard at what it is that just fell in the middle of the yard when it detonates. And I got to tell you, flashbangs, very effective. It was not a good day. I spent the rest of the day going, yeah, trying to I couldn't hear a thing. So you get to the SWAT team. You found that rewarding, I assume. Are you still a member of the SWAT team with your agency?
I am. Yeah, I do find it rewarding. One of the things our CO made us do on day 0 was write an essay on why we wanted to be on the SWAT team. And one of the things that I put in that essay is that, especially as I get older, and I was the oldest one in my SWAT academy, I have a lot of internal motivation, but I want to be part of a group that will push me. I will happily, push my group, but it is a group of guys that are problem solvers, and everyone that I work with on the SWAT team wants to figure out a better way to fix whatever problem is that we're dealing with, whether whatever it may be, and that's a really good group to be around. It's not people who complain or moan or whine about stuff. These are guys that just get stuff done. They see work and they do it. It's good for your psyche to be around guys like that. It's good for my psyche to be around guys like that, because it reminds me that there's always, you can always hold yourself to a higher standard. And so that's why I enjoy being on this team is that attitude, that culture of training and improvement.
My father used to say, if you find yourself the smartest person in the room, it's time to find a new room. And on top of that, our pastor of our church, Minister Ted, likes to say it's important as a man, it's important to have old guy friends, meaning people have been around longer who have wisdom and knowledge that you can't possibly have, and let that rub off on you. And I think that's an excellent point you made about just having people around that will challenge you to get better all the time, because there's always something you can improve on. There's a lot of skills that are involved in being a law enforcement officer of any kind, but especially a SWAT officer, and you can always get better at something. Like I say on the channel with John, cops need to go to the range and practice the thing they suck at. If your shooting skills, for example, aren't what they need to be, as an individual officer or deputy or agent, you know that. You know it, and you know that you're going out there kind of half-cocked, and your skills aren't where they need to be to make it, say, a difficult shot, a shot at range. Like this Tucson officer recently who got 5 rounds off and center punched a guy at 40 yards with a pistol. If your skills aren't there, you know that, and you need to get better at them. And I'm sure that environment of being around all those people who are squared away absolutely helped you be a better cop in general and a better SWAT cop in particular. You are also a field training officer. How does that selection process? Do you volunteer, or are you asked to be an FTO?
I mean, it can be both. Ultimately, you have to volunteer. Although a lot of people are told, "Hey, I think you should do this." It's funny that you mentioned. Yeah, voluntold, indeed. It's funny that you mentioned. I think it was your pastor or your dad said, the older guys, and you think some of my most valuable friends are guys that have been on the department for 30 plus years, and they're not necessarily on the SWAT team, but some of them are. But that level, just the experience, it's really hard to. I mean, it's impossible to replicate that. People that have been cops since the early 80s, they've seen a lot of things come and go. And I really value being able to talk to those guys and get that input from them. And I think there's something to be said for training. And believe me, I am a training junkie and I'm always out there, but there's also just something to be said for experience, for just time in the saddle. Departments, we deal with staffing issues, especially these days. We're dealing with staffing issues, and we're losing people that are going to other states and other departments, or just leaving law enforcement altogether. And the big tragedy there is we're losing a lot of experience that we can't get back. We'll just have to wait and rebuild that experience, but we can't get it back. But for me, I waited until I had almost 7 years on the department to become a field training officer. I think you are eligible at about 3 years. But I waited until I had 7 years. I really wanted to feel like I had a really solid grasp on this job before I started teaching other people. And for me, I think that was a good call. There are certainly guys that have started field training sooner than me. They after a couple, 3-4 years, and some of them are great FTOs. But for me, I really wanted that experience, and I think that experience is valuable. It allows you to come from that position of experience when you're talking to your trainees, and I think that's good for them too. 7 years, you apply, and then it's just an interview. There's no physical aspect to that. So it's similar to the SWAT interview. You put on your uniform, and then you're interviewed by a panel of sergeants or lieutenants, or a makeup of both, and then they select people. And then there is an FTO academy, and the FTO academy it's all classroom work, and it's 40 hours, so it's 1 week. So you go to that, and then you become an FTO.
So before I let you go, Asa, what would you tell a young man or woman who is maybe getting out of the military and considering a career in law enforcement? And right now it's really hard to get qualified candidates for law enforcement, because why would anyone in their right mind want to become a cop in this current environment of defund the police and all cops are bad, et cetera, et cetera? But you get someone who is still interested, they still want to do this thing, and they're getting out of the Navy or the Marine Corps, or the Army, or the Air Force. What single piece of advice would you give them as they start to apply for agencies?
One of the best pieces of advice I got was from an old narcotics cop that had done a lot of undercover work, and he was talking about in this case he was referencing talking to dope dealers when he was buying them, but what he said was you have to be genuine, and so don't try and be something you're not. So it's kind of like we were talking earlier. If you're a janitor, be the best janitor you can be, and if you're wherever you come from, whatever your walk of life is, just be genuine about who you were, and that will come through, and that will be more valuable throughout your whole career. Whether you're talking to a recruiter, who the recruiter's probably been a cop for a long time, and it's kind of their job to smell BS. So or whether you're talking to an OG gang member on the street, that guy's going to know if you try and puff up and pretend to be something you're not. I've gotten further by looking, an OG gang member looks me in the eye and goes, "Oh, you're a rookie." And I go, "Sure am, first day on the job, but I'm going to do it." And they will respect that. And so I think my advice would be just be true to who you are, be genuine about what your experiences are. And like you said earlier, if there's something you think you're lacking, whatever it be it shooting skills, be it grappling skills, be it talking skills, go seek those out. Don't be afraid to start training. You're going to fail. That's how we learn. But don't be afraid to go seek those out.
Asa, that is absolutely phenomenal advice. And I want to thank you so much for being on the show. I hope that there are some younger folks out there listening and getting some good information out of this particular episode. I know this is different from our normal format, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, do us a favor and go over and give us a rating and a review on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. It really helps us out. And don't forget to stay tuned for my interview with Steve Gutowski and the Gutowski Files coming right up after this episode. Asa, thanks again.
Thanks so much, Mike.
All right, folks, it's that time of the week again. It's time for the Gutowski Files, starring Stephen Gutowski, our good friend, who is the founder of TheReload.com and the host of the weekly Reload podcast. Stephen, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. We actually had a big YouTuber on the podcast recently, Ian McCollum from Forgotten Weapons. So right up there with you as one of our podcast guests, and John. So we're reeling in all the big YouTubers.
You guys, I predict your site and your podcast and your YouTube channel are going to grow exponentially. I just know they are because it's quality content, and you are putting out quality stuff right from the jump. So people will go back and look at older stuff once they discover the channel, and they'll see the episode with Mike Williver and they'll be like, "Well, this is peak Reload right here."
That's right. It's all downhill from there. That's what I'm using to draw people in is the Mike Williver episode. It's
right. It's like a drug dealer.
Look who we can get.
The first one's always free, get you hooked.
Yeah, that's right. So this is like Doritos. You can't eat just one.
Is that
Doritos? I don't know.
Pringles, once you pop the top, you can't stop. Anyway.
Yeah, there it is.
We're not giving free advertising to Pringles and Doritos.
Yeah.
So this week we're talking about a lawsuit. And I'll let you go into the details, but against a website called Arms List. Arms List is, I'm guessing they crafted their name based on Craigslist or something like that. But basically, It's an online place where you can buy and sell firearms, and they have been sued, and that suit was dismissed. So if you want to tell our listeners who sued them and on what grounds it was dismissed.
Yeah, well, it turns out that a Boston resident can't sue a Pennsylvania-based company in Massachusetts for a gun that was sold to a third party in Rhode Island, is effectively the gist of this one. The Arms List is, as you put it there, basically Craigslist for guns. It's really a classified site. They're not involved in the sale of the guns, right? They're not an FFL. They don't take possession of the gun. They don't do anything like that. They're just a place that people can list the guns that they have for sale. This is controversial to people in the gun control movement because they tend to be private sales, right? So sales between non-licensed, people who aren't dealers. And that's the kind of sale that in most states, you don't need to go through a background check in order to purchase a gun. So this is a controversial thing. This is what universal background checks are about, right? The proposal that's been sort of the centerpiece of the gun control movement for the last 20 or 30 years now. They want background checks on those sales too, and sometimes even beyond just sales on all transfers, like the House bill that we saw last year that got passed but didn't make it through the Senate. So Arms List facilitates these kinds of sales by allowing people to post classified ads about what guns they're selling. And so you've seen a number of gun control groups try to hold Arms List liable for anything that happens with a gun that was sold through a listing on Arms List. And that's what happened in this case. A police officer in Boston was shot by a criminal who bought a gun through a private sale in Rhode Island by finding out about it through an advertisement on Arms List. And so they wanted to Brady was a plaintiff in this case. This is Brady supported case. Brady's one of the major gun control groups. And so they wanted to sue to hold Arms List liable for this shooting, even though obviously Arms List didn't have any involvement in the shooting beyond the fact that the gun at one point was listed for sale on their, through classified ads on their website. So a Massachusetts state court judge threw the lawsuit out with prejudice, meaning that it can't be refiled again. So this is another win for Arms List, which has had a series of wins in court over this exact question. So this is another one, sort of proving this tactic that gun control groups have been employing just isn't working right now.
Of course, Stephen, no one wants to see a police officer get shot, and we're very sympathetic to that individual. However, this is kind of like suing the local newspaper because they ran a classified ad that sold a car and somebody drove drunk and killed somebody with it. It's just, I mean, I think that's almost a perfect analogy, because just because the site is strictly firearms shouldn't change the heart of the matter, which is they're just a site where people can list things, and things can be, they're not selling it through the site, I guess is what I'm trying to say. They're not sending it off to Arms List somewhere and then they're running a background check and sending it to the purchaser or anything like that. And the idea, this is my opinion now, the idea that this crook wouldn't have gotten a gun some other way and ended up killing or trying to kill a cop is preposterous, because this is just one of a million ways. And again, the person who shot the officer wasn't even the person that bought the gun off of the website. So it was, I mean, I don't know if this was a straw purchase per se, but I think the whole grounds of the lawsuit were pretty ridiculous. I'm shocked they heard it in the first place, to be honest with you.
Well, I mean, it wasn't very successful for the plaintiffs here. Here's the quote from the judge, the key quote. Here, Arms List activities in Massachusetts were completely unrelated and extraneous to the sale between Johnson and McNamara in New Hampshire. Sorry, it wasn't Rhode Island, it was New Hampshire. My mistake, even though those are the same state, in my opinion. But just kidding. They are very similar. But anyway, New Hampshire, and the shooting that occurred thereafter, the claims against Arms List are hereby dismissed with prejudice. So effectively, they sued in Massachusetts over a sale that was advertised in New Hampshire. And so you can't, the ruling here is that you simply can't hold them responsible for what happened because they weren't really involved in anything. And then additionally, there's a Section 230 question at play here as well, because Arms List didn't create the ad for this gun that they're trying to sue them over, that Brady and the officer, the victim in this case, are trying to sue Arms List over. It wasn't created by Arms List. It was posted by a third party, and we know that with Section 230 protections, websites are not held liable for content posted on them by third parties. Websites like Arms List or Craigslist or Facebook or Twitter, all these. This gets talked about a lot with social media companies, especially in relation to, things like Donald Trump, former President Trump, being removed from Twitter or Facebook. But this really extends way beyond that, and it also includes protections for companies like Arms List, where they host ads created by other people that they haven't moderated or vetted in any way necessarily, proactively. So that was another part of this situation that's sort of interesting, because one, this case deals not only with liability protection for Arms List for being a company that hosts advertisements for private gun sales, but also it deals in Section 230 protections against liability for online publications or websites that host third-party content.
Right. Like, for example, with the Facebook or Twitter analogy would be if somebody gets on Facebook and says, let's kill all the guys named Doug, and then somebody goes out and kills a guy named Doug based on what he read, they can't hold Facebook accountable for that because they didn't write the material. They just had a service to host that person posting things or whatever the case may be.
Exactly. And so it's designed to allow people to, it's designed basically to allow companies to publish a lot of things, have a more robust sort of conversation, and not be held liable for every post that gets shown up. Because you think about something like take Arms List, for example. It's a very popular website. They get, I'm sure, hundreds of thousands of listings every year on Arms List, or Gun Broker, or a number of other gun sales, facilitate, classified ad websites, basically. And it's not possible for a company like Arms List to go through and manually review every single post before it goes up. It is, but you'd have to reduce how many posts could be published, right? And most likely, if they were held liable for all the posts being published, they would publish far fewer of them. They'd be much more conservative about which listings they allow on the website, if that makes sense. So that's where these sort of protections, the positive end of thing. Obviously, there's people who there's robust debate about the negative impact of Section 230, or at least what some people think about social media censorship, self-imposed censorship. But this is what the Met law is meant to do. It's meant to keep arms list and companies like that protected from liability if a third party posts something. And it's sort of interesting in this case because it's not. I don't know that the posting on arms list was illegal either, right? There's no indication of that from what I've read that the posting is. So they're trying to really extend liability way beyond what has been accepted up to this point. And that's kind of been the goal of the gun control groups for a while now when it comes to liability for gun dealers or manufacturers or distributors or marketplaces. This one was not successful. It hasn't been successful for any of them. And there's a federal law that protects a lot of these companies called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. And so the gun control groups have been trying to get around that in one way or another for 30 years or 20 years since it was passed in the early 2000s. And this is part of that. And it just hasn't been successful so far.
Well, I think we got the outcome we would have hoped for. I think it was kind of the obvious outcome, but that doesn't always mean it's going to go the way you think it's going to go. And I think this time it went as well as could be hoped. Stephen, thank you so much for being here. Folks listening, if you are a fan of this sort of content, pop on over to thereload.com and give it a look and consider giving Stephen a couple of bucks in the form of a membership. He needs money to do what he's doing. This stuff is not cheap and it's not free. He's got a reporter to pay. He's got overhead expenses, and he wants to keep doing it. And I want him to keep doing it. So check out thereload.com and check out the Weekly Reload podcast. Stephen, thanks so much for being here, buddy.
Thanks for having me on.